Welcome to Webster Now with your host, Garrett Wagner.
Sometimes the biggest decisions in your town aren't hiding in plain sight. They're hiding in those details. The local election, where a lot of voters suddenly discover what a candidate actually stands for, usually after the decision starts getting made. The contract clause, nobody noticed until somebody read that fine print. The environmental monitoring data, buried deep inside a technical report. The letter that shows up in your mailbox that most people throw it away without opening. And the public meeting where you can actually ask questions about property taxes. But people don't even realize it's happening. Tonight's episode is about those moments where people will suddenly stop and say, wait, that was there? Because it turns out the details that seem boring are often those that matter the most. And we're talking about a contract connected to the RNG project that contained a liability clause, raising questions about taxpayer protection. We'll look at new concerns raised about monitoring data and noise at the Xerox solar project. We'll talk about a mailer coming to Webster homes that could affect the data used in your property assessment, which is really important. You don't want your taxes going up. And we'll cover upcoming community meetings where you can ask questions directly about the reassessment process to someone that knows what they're talking about. Plus a quick look ahead at the next community town election and one community event that might surprise book lovers in Webster. But before we get to all that, just a quick reminder, everything here today is my perspective only. Nothing said here reflects official town policy or action. Now when it comes to local government, the biggest surprises usually are what people did, right? It's what was sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone to notice. So before we get into contracts, solar projects, and reassessments, it's worth starting with a question that ultimately shapes all of those decisions. Who we elect to lead the town. Because when it comes to things like taxes, redevelopment, environmental policy, and long-term planning for Webster, those choices ultimately comes down to the people who we choose to put in those roles. The people, not the party. In the upcoming town election, November 2026, mark those calendars, we're going to see another race between Sean Hanna and Alex Sheldon. Now, local elections often fly under the radar. Turnout's usually low, which means a relatively small number of people can end up determining decisions that affect all of us. In fact, the last supervisor election, November 2025, was decided by like 65 votes, right? It was originally 7, it went to 65. That's it. That's a tiny margin shaping decisions for the entire town of Webster. And that's one of the reasons this show will spend time covering the election over the coming weeks and months. We're going to be talking to the candidates, discussing the issues that affect Webster, and helping all of us better understand where the candidates stand. Because ideally, we shouldn't be learning about someone's priorities after they're elected. We should know beforehand. Because elections are often the moment when people suddenly hear something about a candidate and think, wait. That's what they stand for? The more informed you're going to be on election day, the better decisions we can make for our community. You ever notice the most important part of a contract are usually the parts nobody actually reads? Which, come on, to be fair, that's basically all contracts. And honestly, I get it, right? Most of us approach legal documents the same way we approach the term and conditions on our phone. Scroll, agree. But when it comes to municipal contracts, the fine print matters a lot because those clauses determine whether taxpayers are protected or exposed. And during a recent discussion involving the MSC consulting contract tied to the RNG project, several deals in the contract questions were raised up. One of them was language referring to an 80-20 split, which is required clarification about how the work would actually be structured and what services would be provided. There's a test that needed to be done that we had to look into. The board needed to define who was doing what between the consultant and us. But the bigger issue was a clause that limited MSC's liability. The contracts say that MSC's total liability would be capped the amount of fees the town paid them. Now, in plain English for you non-lawyers, here's what that means. If something went wrong and the damages were larger than the consulting fee, the town's ability to recover the cost would be capped. In other words, if the town paid only $100,000 to the consultant, if something created a multi-million-dollar problem, the town's liability cap would be limited to the $100,000. And that's why contract language isn't boring. Contract language determines whether taxpayers are protected or exposed. MSC staff clarified this clause is typically used in contract involving for-profit companies and said it had been included in error. And they indicated they'd remove it. But the decision highlighted something important. Some members of the board emphasized the urgency of the project timeline. Others stressed something equally important. Getting the contract right before approving it. And there was another item on the agenda involving a motion related to a law firm that appeared again after it didn't go through the prior one, but was ultimately removed after determining the services weren't needed, right? And look, I know this stuff feels technical, right? It can be a little boring, but these details are exactly what determines whether we pay more later. And because here's the frustrating part: most residents, they're never going to see the language, right? They're not going to read the contract. They won't see the clause. They only see the result if something goes wrong later. And that's the worst part. And that's why contract review really matters. Because when timelines get tight and projects start moving fast, the temptation is always to say, let's just get this approved. But guess what? Contracts don't care about deadlines. The reality is once they're signed, they're binding, which means the moment to catch things is before they're approved, not after.
Too bad. You've already signed the deal.
Actually, he hasn't.
No.
When residents hear about a liability cap buried in a consulting contract, it's easy to have that moment where you stop and say, wait, that was in there? So if the contract fine print matters, the conversation happening in our community matters just as much. Because sometimes the biggest things affecting a project aren't buried in a technical report. They show up when the people, all of you, speak up. And that's exactly what's happening during recent public comments about the Xerox Montante solar project. Members of the community showed up. They used their voices to talk about the potential pros and cons of the project. Some spoke about the opportunity for renewable energy and benefits that solar can bring to our town. Others raised questions about things like possible impact in surrounding neighborhoods and long-term environmental considerations. Now, regardless of where people stood on the issue, it's worth recognizing something important. And I couldn't be happier. People showed up. They participated. They made sure their perspectives were part of the conversation. And come on, that's exactly how local government is supposed to work. And it's something we all should applaud. And I applaud all of you that are participating, no matter which side of the fence you're on. So the conversation around this project is still unfolding. And this discussion is starting to appear in the broader community conversations, which is great. For example, Sean Hanna, we already mentioned him. He's running for town supervisor. He recently submitted a letter to the Webster Herald outlining his perspective on the project and the policies surrounding it. And moments like this are exactly why staying informed matters. Because sometimes information shaping an issue isn't always front and center. It's in the public comments. It's in the community discussions. It's in the articles and letters people write to share their perspectives. And every now and then, that's when we all have that moment where we stop and say, wait, that was in there? So stay tuned, because in upcoming episodes, we'll be taking a deeper dive into this project and the issues surrounding it, the pros and cons, to help keep all of us informed. Hey, Webster, there's a letter coming to homes in early June that most people will treat the same way we treat a lot of official mail. Quick glance, maybe open it, probably not, right? And eventually ends up in a pile somewhere with the trash. Come on, it's understandable. Because reassessment letters, they make people nervous, right? Are your taxes going up? I don't want to deal with it. But this particular letter isn't telling you what your property taxes are. It's asking you to confirm something much simpler. The basic facts about your house. As part of the preparation for Webster's 2027 townwide reevaluation, the town's appraiser, the KLW Group, will be sending mailers asking you to verify your property data. Here's what they're looking for. They want to know about things like bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, and other property features. Now, here's the unfortunate part people don't realize. The response rate for these mailers is typically less than 5%, right? So if every 100 that goes out, less than 5 reply, which means the vast majority of homeowners never respond. And if you ignore the mailer, you're essentially telling the appraisal team, whatever you have in file is correct, even if it isn't. And that matters because reassessments rely on something called the mass appraisal model, a system that compares properties across the town using the data available. Right? They still do spot checks. They're still going to look into it to make sure it's right. So not filling that out doesn't you out of the process. Right? Because if the data going into the model isn't accurate, the results may not be accurate either. And look, the reassessment makes people nervous, okay? Especially when the process feels confusing or unfamiliar. But this step is actually one of the simplest ways you can protect yourselves. So please, open the mail, look at it, check the information, confirm it's right, update it, send the form back. We can do better than 5%. Because this is one of those moments where something small, a simple letter in your mailbox, could quietly affect the data tied to your property. And a lot of residents might not realize that until much, much later. When they start to think, wait, if I threw that letter away, what did they do? Now, we got good news on the reassessment process. Because if it still feels confusing, one, you're not alone, right? Because really, for most homeowners, reassessments are one of those things that suddenly show up in a conversation every few years, a long time for Webster. Usually right at the time that people start worrying about their property taxes. But the second important thing you got to know, there's opportunity coming up where you can hear directly from the team responsible for the process. And trust me, they're amazing. They're knowledgeable. They care and they love to help. On March 26th, Webster will host a 2027 townwide revaluation community meeting. The presentation will be led by the town assessor, the amazing, the gifted, the talented, the wonderful Donna. And the goal is pretty straightforward. Explain to you how the reassessment process works. Answer your questions. What can you expect to see as the process moves forward? And most importantly, you can ask her questions directly. And she does an amazing, amazing job of answering. We're lucky, so lucky as a town to have her. Because the truth is, a lot of confusion around reassessments doesn't come from the numbers. It comes from us just not understanding the process. And moments like this are the ones where the easiest way to clear that up. Show up, ask your questions. I've gone to some of these. The questions vary, and the people always leave feeling better afterwards, understand what's going on. Because sometimes people don't realize those opportunities exist until later, when they're already frustrated or confused. And that's when you hear someone say, wait, there was a meeting where I could have asked questions about my property taxes? All right, after all that serious stuff tonight, let's end with a surprise that's a little more fun from one of my favorite places in town, the library. Because sometimes the things hiding in plain sight around the town are actually good surprises. On March 14th, the Friends of the Webster Public Library, that amazing group, are hosting a vintage book sale at the Webster Public Library from 10 to 1. And if you're someone who loves old books, this is worth checking out. They're going to be around 14 tables of books, biographies, art, history, and more. Some of the highlights they're already promoting: Easton Press editions, Ernest Hemingway titles, Don Pendleton series, and even Isaac Asimov magazines. Right? Come on, I know you're into it. And the best of all, most books are priced under $20. All proceeds go to supporting programs of the library, which we know and love. Come on, get in there. So if you like the idea of discovering something unexpected, this might be one of those moments where you walk in and think, wait, Hemingway for under $20? That's a deal. Tonight's theme was pretty simple. Sometimes the biggest things affecting your town, they're not the big headlines. They're in the details. And none of those things are flashy. Most of them, none of them go viral. But they deeply matter. Because the strength of their community isn't built around one big moment. It's built on a ton of small moments, little pebbles, where residents choose to stay informed, ask questions, and participate. And the more of us who pay attention to those details, the stronger Webster becomes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, following, sharing with a fellow Webster resident, whatever you want, because the more we spread this information, the more informed our community becomes and the better it becomes. So thank you for spending a few minutes getting informed with us tonight. And remember, every step we take together is a step towards a better Webster.
You've been watching Webster Now with Garrett Wagner. Join us next time for more local news and updates.